Rules Committee to come to order, and thank you very much for joining us today. I'm delighted to have both of you here, Diane and Mr. Yarmouth. The opportunity to have you and John is something we've been looking forward to for quite some time, and with great buildup of anticipation, the great Diane Black appears. Today, we will be considering H-Con Res 71, establishing the congressional budget for the United States government for fiscal year 2018, and setting forth the appropriations budgetary levels for fiscal year 2019 through 2027. The bottom line is, if we do not change course in our tax and spending policies, our economy and workforce will be crippled with a mountain of debt, and we will not be prepared to leave our children and grandchildren a better product after all the hard work we have done. The resulting stagnant growth, rising unemployment, falling wages, and skyrocketing interest rates will dramatically limit opportunities and prosperity for all Americans. And while I take note of the article that was in the Washington Post 2 weeks ago that noted for the first time in years there was a 3.5% increase in take-home pay, it is not enough for us to say more take-home pay for all Americans has been achieved. We need long sustained economic growth, and this to sustain the viability of these programs, all the way including Medicare. So it's our job to make sure that we're not only looking ahead, but making the decisions that are necessary. H-Con Res 71, I think, seeks to balance the budget within 10 years by cutting spending, reforming government, and growing the economy to produce a surplus by 2027. That should be the plan, should be the goal, should be a goal that every one of us have. The budget makes strategic investments to rebuild and expand our military, including $621.5 billion in base funding for the National Defense Budget, $75 billion for the war on terrorism, and increasing border and homeland security funding at a time I think that we need it. The budget treats veterans also as a top priority. It returns power to states. More people make local decisions. Local governments make decisions. Individuals make more decisions. And it unleashes the free enterprise system in such a way that it encourages them to make involvement and investment into the economy. The budget also sets non-defense discretionary spending at $511 billion and sets a roadmap by eliminating the deficit, implementing pro-growth tax reform, and reforming entitlements to ensure that the viability for continued and future generations is achieved. With that, I'd like to welcome our first panel. The first panel that we have already welcomed, in fact, is made up of not only the chairman of the House Budget Committee, Congresswoman Black, my dear friend from Tennessee, but also a gentleman equally versed in not only the budget priorities of this nation, but a gentleman who's right across the border there in the state of Kentucky. So the ranking member, John Yarmouth, we welcome both of you. So without objection, anything you have in writing will be into the record. And I look forward to your testimony and the engagement with the Rules Committee. Before we come to you, Chairwoman Black, I'd like to yield to the ranking member, the gentleman from Massachusetts, for any opening statement the gentleman chooses to make. Gentleman's recognized.
Well, thank you, Mr. Chairman. I want to thank our witnesses for being here. It's often been said that budgets are moral documents. They basically state what we value, what we think is important, and I, with all due respect to my Republican friends, H-Con Res 71 doesn't represent my values. In fact, it's quite the opposite. This is a budget that, if it were followed, I think would create a government without a conscience. I think it is a budget that would turn this country into a tale of two cities, if you will, because it's particularly harsh on the most vulnerable. And, I look through where the savings are. I mean, cuts in Medicare and Medicaid, this obscene cut of $154 billion from the Supplemental Nutrition Assistance Program known as SNAP, and then you throw in another $10 billion in cuts from reconciliation, cuts in transportation funding, and financial aid programs. And I think it's all aimed at one thing, and that is paving the way for, a tax cut that benefits primarily the wealthiest people in this country. So, I'm going to, do everything I can to speak out against this because I think these are the wrong priorities for this country. I guess if you believe in trickle-down economics, this is the way to go because it paves the way for this tax cut that benefits wealthy people. But President George Bush the first referred to trickle-down economics as voodoo economics. I think this is deja voodoo economics. So we'll have an interesting debate, but I hope it doesn't result in cementing what the priorities of this Congress is going to be. And welcome you here, and yield back my time.
Thank you very much. The gentleman and I had breakfast this morning, and he and I enjoy the job that we do, the job that we have. He takes very seriously the ideas that he believes will support and sustain his ideas, and both of you feel the same. We're delighted that you're here. The gentlewoman from Tennessee, distinguished young gentlewoman, is recognized.
I thank you, Mr. Chairman. I thank the members of the committee for having me here today to testify on our fiscal year 2018 budget resolution. Today, I am proud to talk about the budget, building a better America. It truly reflects the conservative governing vision, and I couldn't be more proud of the work that my committee did to put this together. When it was approved back in July, this budget received unanimous Republican support of the House Budget Committee. We named it Building a Better America because the contents of our budget provide building blocks for balancing the budget, promoting economic growth, unlocking tax reform, and supporting a robust and capable military. Our budget acknowledges that achieving balance is a challenge, but it proves it is not an impossible task. Like families and small businesses across America know all too well, balancing a budget simply requires that we live within our means. And that is the foundational principle of our budget for the federal government. In order to achieve balance in 10 years, Building a Better America identifies wasteful spending and also recommends much-needed reforms to mandatory spending programs. Mandatory spending already makes up more than 2/3 of all federal government spending, and that number will only continue to grow. We need to start addressing mandatory spending, which is why our budget uses reconciliation to achieve the largest mandatory reform package in 20 years. It requires that at least $203 billion in mandatory spending cuts, and it begins to change the culture of excessive spending here in Washington. My hope is that every year, Congress can come back and look at our mandatory spending programs in the budget to make sure that the government is spending within its means and that the government programs are working for the American people. In addition to reforming the government programs and reducing spending, our budget begins the process of rebuilding our military. With threats on the rise around the world, Building a Better America provides our men and women in uniform with the resources that they need to face and complete the missions with which they are tasked. Our budget invests, as the chairman says, $621.5 billion in our military and $75 billion specifically for the global war on terror for the fiscal year of 2018. And equally important, our budget makes tax reform possible. Using reconciliation, our budget paves the way for pro-growth reform that reduces tax rates, simplifies the tax code, repairs the economy, and empowers hard-working Americans. This is a promise we have all made to improve the lives of our constituents by allowing them to keep more money in their pocket. Passing the budget is the golden key to achieving our goals. This is a consensus budget that reflects the will of our conference, but it also reflects the will of the American people. And it is the fulfillment of the promises we made our voters when we were elected. It is a plan that forces us to govern better by being responsible stewards of the taxpayer dollars and ultimately paying down our massive $20 trillion debt. This is our moment, an opportunity for a real conservative win that preserves the American dream and restores fiscal sanity. Future generations of Americans are counting on us, and failure is not an option. Thank you again for having me, and I look forward to your questions.
Chairwoman Black, thank you very much. Mr. Yarmouth, welcome. We're delighted that Chair Jones is recognized.
Thank you very much, Mr. Chairman, Ranking Member McGovern, and members of the committee. Mr. Chairman, I have to say this is an interesting exercise. We are here to debate a budget resolution that will be opposed by the Democratic caucus and part of the Republican conference. The difference being that Democrats opposing the budget will vote no, while Republicans who oppose the budget will vote yes. They say their goal is to get the budget to conference where all problems will be solved. It's that kind of fantastical thinking that got us the numbers and projections in this budget in the first place. But while a sizable group of Republicans aren't taking this budget seriously, we will. It is a shockingly extreme document. It calls for more than $5 trillion in spending cuts that threaten our economic progress and our national security, and it willfully ignores the needs and priorities of the American people. But this budget isn't about conservative policy or reducing the size of our debt and deficits. It's not even about American families. This budget is about one thing: using the budget reconciliation process to ram through giant tax giveaways to the wealthy and big corporations, and to do it without needing bipartisan support. But it's even more sinister than that. This budget and the tax cuts it exists to support are part of a three-step process Republicans have used before and with serious consequences for our nation and the American people. First, you propose massive tax cuts for the rich, claiming they will generate so much economic growth that they will pay for themselves. Last week, as we all know, your conference announced a $2.4 trillion tax cut plan. It clearly benefits the wealthy at the expense of nearly everyone else. For example, under this tax plan, millions of families making $50,000 a year would be subject to a tax increase, while millionaires would get, on average, a $230,000 tax cut. In total, individuals will see their taxes go up by more than $470 billion, while corporations, wealthy pass-through entities, and rich estates get a tax cut totaling $2.9 trillion. Once fully phased in, 80% of the entire tax cut in this plan goes to just the top 1%. While 45% of all households with children see a tax increase. And no matter how many times President Trump, Secretary Mnuchin, or anyone in this room or on the House floor says it, these tax cuts won't pay for themselves. Conservative economist and former CBO Director Douglas Holtz-Eakin said, quote, "There's just no evidence that the tax cuts actually pay for themselves," end quote. And he's not alone. The Federal Reserve, the CBO, the Goldman Sachs, and just recently, Bruce Bartlett, the author of Reaganomics, has said the notion that tax cuts pay for themselves is nonsense. And he used another word as well. But the historical record is also clear. We went through this in the early 80s, the early 2000s under President George W. Bush, and we saw it play out to disastrous effect in Kansas recently. Now you want to try it again, this time with a plan that will increase deficits and debt by approximately $2.4 trillion in the first 10 years alone, and trillions more in the years after that. These tax cuts aren't going to magically defy historical precedent, empirical evidence, and expert analysis. They are going to blow enormous holes in the federal budget, which brings me to the second part of the three-step plan. When growth fails to happen as promised, and these tax cuts keep digging our economy down deeper and deeper, you will again bemoan the horrors of deficits and debt. These cries will lead us to the third and final part of the plan. You will call for congressional action, not to roll back the tax cuts to the wealthy that caused all the damage, but for drastic cuts to important programs that the American people need and support: education, healthcare, research, infrastructure, and veterans benefits, all of which are already threatened in this budget. It calls for trillions of dollars in cuts to vital national priorities, including $1.5 trillion from Medicare and Medicaid alone. The enormity of these cuts and the severity of the consequences for American families cannot be overstated. But more cuts will be coming if you get your way with your tax plan. We will see more attacks on Medicare, Medicaid, Social Security, nutrition assistance, on important benefits and services that help American families get ahead, and on key investments that help our economy and our nation be strong. Democrats have a different budget and a far different vision for our country. We invest in programs that will grow our economy, create good-paying jobs, and provide real support for working families. We make a strong commitment to infrastructure, education, retirement security, child care for hardworking parents, and affordable quality health care for all Americans. We believe in a government that helps individuals with nowhere left to turn and a responsible tax code that helps families get ahead. Those are the priorities of American families, and they should be the priorities of this Congress and this committee. I therefore ask that you make my substitute in order for debate and consideration on the floor. I also ask that you make in order the substitute budgets ordered by our colleagues from the Congressional Black Caucus and the Congressional Progressive Caucus. With that, I thank you for your attention, and I yield back.
Mr. Armour, thank you very much. Mr. Armour, you gave some pretty straightforward discussion about the results of tax cuts and what their effects would have that might be, I think you termed them negatively, might negatively impact the budget. What is the difference between now when we have high taxes and 1996, I believe, when we cut capital gains tax, and we were told it would cost the government $9 billion and produce $554 billion worth of increase to the government alone, and we balanced the budget in 1 year.
Well, when you cut capital gains rates after a long time, you obviously get a one-time or short-term blip in revenue to the government.
But we didn't even guess that. Nobody even guessed that.
Well, I mean, that's what happens because people have been holding assets for a long time that are appreciated, see an opportunity to dispose of them for a much lower tax rate. So you also had the situation in which you had a brand-new economy being developed in the country, namely the internet, and the high-tech industry. So you had a lot of factors going on. But you can look at, again, back to the 80s, back to the Bush tax cuts, and there is virtually no evidence anywhere, and you won't find many economists anywhere who will say that tax cuts come even close to paying for themselves. Goldman Sachs just recently said they anticipated that the tax cut proposal that was put forward by the administration and the Republicans would raise the growth in the economy by 0.1% to 0.2%, not nearly enough to pay for them. Again, CBO says they don't. Bruce Bartlett, again, the author of Reaganomics, said when they actually created the theory of Reaganomics, that they anticipated that at most, they didn't say this, but they anticipated at most that the tax cuts, that the revenue generated from the tax cuts would pay for maybe 30% of the tax cuts. So it's not that there is no economic benefit from the tax cuts, it's just that it doesn't come close to paying for them.
So President Obama had an opportunity to raise taxes. As I recall, the next year they had 0% GDP growth. Is that right?
Well, he had the opportunity to raise taxes. We were in the midst of one of the greatest recessions of our time. So that I don't know that you can connect those two. The argument you're trying to make is that by raising taxes, you harm the economy.
I'm asking a question. I'm
Well,
not trying to push
I mean,
anything.
the taxes were raised under Bill Clinton, and you had huge economic growth.
Was that why the country put Republicans in charge? The economic, it happened because of a series of factors.
That is always
And
the case.
biggest
That is
one
always
was
the case.
We aim for
Yeah.
balance in the budget.
That is always the case, that there are many factors contributing to them.
So the confidence of the American people, where do you find the confidence of the American people keeping taxes right where they are?
Well, personally, I haven't heard a great outcry for tax relief from the American people. And I think that I'm not sure there's any poll right now that shows that that's one of the issues that's high on their priority list. It's much more, they're more concerned about good jobs, well-paying jobs, security, retirement security, education, healthcare. Taxes are nowhere near the top of those lists.
Okay. Well, Mrs. Black, I want you to know I'm from a place called Dallas, Texas. It is a, unfortunately, faster-growing city than we can keep up with. The number of jobs, the job creation, the marketplace is in a boom. We've got people moving from all over the country. Texas somehow has this aura right now of not raising taxes, being for free markets, opportunities for people to make more decisions by themselves, or perhaps most of all, pretty good understanding about we are not competitive around the globe, and that's what Texas and Dallas spends a good bit of its time doing, producing about 38% of everything we make, which is pretty much the national average, to export, to move overseas, to compete globally, to create more jobs that we have. We have not seen our economy growing, but we've seen the world economy has grown a bit for American-made products. So evidently, since the world that I come from is asking for this, I would ask you to please continue doing what you're doing. I think that there is always a caveat of don't oversell, over-deliver. And I wanted to ask you about that. Overselling, or you going to over-deliver? What's going to happen a year from now when we do this?
Well, Mr. Chairman, thank you. And I think it's really interesting that just the talk of tax reform is seeing the economy start to pick up. We saw in this last quarter a 3.1% GDP growth. There seems to be a lot of excitement out there. I do want to reference that, and this will be.
Excuse me, sir. Could I have you take that conversation outside the committee room? It might not be distracting there, but it is on this side. No, that's okay. Thank you very much. Gentleman may continue.
I do want to reference something that has gone out to all members, to the members of the United States Congress, that we have 242 different organizations that are representative across this entire nation, all the way from the American Bankers Association to the American Farm Bureau Federation, the Business Roundtable, U.S. Business Roundtable, Financial Services Forum, Manufacturing Housing, National Retail, National Grocers. I think it's interesting, and my good friend and colleague from just right up the road from me, the Tennessee Chamber of Commerce, is supportive of this tax reform package, as well as, or I should say, of tax reform in general, because we don't really have a package out there right now. We do have a blueprint that we have done. But also the Kentucky Chamber is for doing tax reform. The U.S. Chamber of Commerce and many others has been referenced in this piece of paper that has 242 different organizations that say tax reform is important. Here's what I say. I'm a pretty simple gal. I say, if I have more money in my pocket, generally I will spend that money on goods and services. When goods and services are purchased, that means there's a creation of another job, which means then that someone else has more money in their pocket to actually buy another goods or service. And I think that we will see this economy grow. Does it pay for itself? We also have to look at the other side of our spending. And as I said in my opening remarks, that if we continue to spend more than what we bring in year after year, it doesn't matter how much tax reform we do. We have got to have restraint on what we spend. 2/3 of our spending now is on the mandatory side. Until we do something about that, we're never going to get balanced. And so it's two sides to that seesaw, not just one. Giving people more opportunities for having more money, more businesses to grow, create more jobs is a good thing for our economy. We're stagnant, let's face it, up to 2% growth over the last 8 to 9 years. That's not even average for this United States of America. Average, since we've been keeping track, is 3%. So we've got to get the economy moving. We've got to help American families. And I'm very proud that this tax reform, at least the framework that we've put out, does help the middle income. That really was our whole focus in the Ways and Means Committee, is to be sure that we were addressing what we believe is the most important thing, is helping the middle income. And so for folks to be talking right now about this scenario or that scenario. I'm not even sure how they get there, Mr. Chairman, because we still haven't put the brackets out. So I don't know what they're figuring those brackets on or where they're getting the information to come up with whatever analysis that they have. But I would just ask people to wait, see what we put out there. We have put out a framework, but that framework doesn't have enough meat on it to do these analysis. And with that, I'll yield back.
Thank you very much. I think the last thing I'd really wonder, and I will look for this, and I think others should, is why do one set of economists think one thing and why do another set of economists think another thing? Well, that's not unusual. As a matter of fact, that's part of the magic of this country and part of being an economist. You can kind of pull up the views that you and dial in those that you want. So I'm going to err on the side of believing that if we give the government less money and give the free enterprise system more money, then we're going to see more benefit. If we're going to aim to knowing that we've blown past not just stop signs, but red lights that have warned us about where we're headed, that if we don't pay attention to that, we're all going to be in trouble. And so I would sooner all of us not be in trouble rather than a few people maybe making money. By the way, I've not seen many poor people create jobs, but I've seen a lot of people and a lot of company-owned companies, employee-owned companies really do well. And the ESOP companies back in Dallas, Texas, want this as much as anybody, and it's about all of us, not some of us. Thank you very much. Mrs. Slaughter.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman, and welcome to our witnesses this afternoon. Let me start with you, Mr. Yarmouth, if I may. The Budget Committee held a markup in July on the budget, and I'm assuming that the cuts were justified that Americans depend on by extolling the virtues of a balanced budget and reducing the debt and saying we can't afford it. Is that the kind of normal procedure?
Yes.
But we do know that they're going to add trillions of dollars to the deficit. I think that's been really brought to all of our attention in a short order. Through the tax cuts to the wealthiest people and corporations, what message do you think the Republicans are sending with that budget?
Well, the Republicans have, as a matter of faith, for many years, believed that if you cut taxes, the benefits will flow down for the wealthiest and corporations, that the benefits will flow down to middle and lower income Americans. That has never happened. As a matter of fact, we have seen over the last 30 years an alarming increase in the disparity in both income and wealth between the very richest Americans and everybody else, to the point at which it is projected that if this tax cut proposed by Republicans would go into effect, and I absolutely agree with Chairman Black that the details aren't all there, but there are enough details there to know that the 1% would gain 50% of the income from this benefit, and their share of the national wealth would increase from about 25%, where it was 30 years ago, to 47% currently.
Almost half.
Almost half of all the wealth and income in the country. So, again, Republicans believe this, that tax cuts help everybody. There's just no historical evidence to support that faith.
I couldn't agree with you more, because we've been through this before and know that it won't work, and I don't want to have to learn that lesson again. More and more low-income families are struggling, but I understand that the taxes at the lowest income would go up. Is that right? 2%?
Depending on details and depending on your family situation.
If you earn less than $50,000.
Right, there are people who would have their income taxes actually raised under this theory, under this proposal, again, the outline, based on the elimination of the personal exemption.
We had quite a healthy debate this morning on the floor on the bill before us there. And I actually made the assertion right out loud that once a child is born, and once it becomes a human being by taking breath, then this Congress is through with it. we cut SNAP, TANF, Child's Health Program has expired, community health hospitals have. And a Head Start lunch program, you name them one after another. The children pretty much have to fend for themselves if they can make it. But I see that they're about to cut another $1 trillion from those programs that the poor really rely on. Is that in the budget?
That's projected
welfare
in the
reform?
Republican budget. A huge cut to, as Mr. McGovern mentioned earlier, a huge cut in the SNAP program, roughly $150 billion. These are, again, the programs that help bridge families' hard times.
Right.
And the statistics are very clear. These are not full-time welfare programs. These are not people who stay on them forever. These are people who are on them for only a few months in most cases. Again, when they're down on their luck, out of work, they help support families and keep their children well cared for and fed. So, putting that additional pressure on those families who are having hard times, who are trying to get off of any federal assistance is shameful.
It sort of belies the notion that this is all for the middle class, all these.
That's
I
true.
don't think any of us believe that much in the first place.
To be perfectly candid, there are things in the tax proposal that would help the middle class. But the combination of effects, again, judging by the outline, is that there are many people in the middle class who would not be helped and would actually be hurt, while no one in the top 1% would be hurt.
Ms. Black, I really admire you as the first woman chair of the Budget Committee. That's a pretty wonderful thing. Congratulations for that.
Well, thank you.
And-
I'm more proud just to be the chair than I am the woman chair. But
Oh, well, I think I worked so hard in my lifetime to try to make it possible for women to do that. So I guess I take some joy in it. But let's get back to business here. The $1.6 billion for the fence, and I've been hearing that they want to raise that to $10 billion for the wall between the United States and Mexico. How much do you expect that wall to cost? And what do you have in the budget for the out years?
I don't have an estimate of what the wall would cost in completion. I don't know that that number is even available. But we allow in our budget for the Homeland Security to use what's in their budget to begin doing what they feel is necessary to secure the border.
Well, I hope that doesn't mean there's a blank check there, does it, for a wall?
Well, they're, as you know, by the appropriations, they are given a dollar amount, and they have to live within their budget.
But you don't have any estimate in here for what that would be?
I do not have an estimate.
Well,
no.
Jim,
Yeah,
Chairwoman,
I'd be happy to, yes.
in the bill that the president signed into law just a few weeks ago, there was an amount given for some 23 miles in South Texas, some 18 miles central Texas on the border, some 14 miles in California, and then money given for a plan, an architectural plan that would enable Congress the opportunity to have an idea. So less money, more plan. And so if you ask another person who's been pretty well involved in it, I would say before we think we're getting the wall, let's get a plan. Because about 2/3 of the border has a wall on or some sort of a barrier. We're
Yeah, I hear
after
San
a
Diego
plan.
has 3. But I hope a person will come along.
Thank you very
That
much.
will say we don't need a wall because the migration is lower than it's been for years, and we've put a lot of money into Border Patrol already. And I, for one, don't see the idea that building a wall doesn't make us look a little foolish. The Republican budget has no cut to mandatory programs in the Function 050 defense. But it does include $33 billion cut to the House Armed Services Committee's allocation, presumably for the other functions in their jurisdiction. 99% of it consists of TRICARE for life, which of course is veterans health care, military retirement, but there's no explanation of that cut. And I wonder, what policy you assume with those cuts?
Ms. Slaughter, we leave this open to the committee itself and where those cuts would be. We don't give them absolute of what they will do. These are reconciliation instructions, and they can decide within their own committee about where those reforms would be. You know, we keep talking about these as cuts, and I think that it is a real mistake for us to think about just a cut. If programs are around for some 30 years, there is benefit in going back and looking at these programs to see if they're working.
Yes.
And we don't do a very good job of that here in Congress, at least in the 6.5 years that I've been here, and going back and saying, is this really working? And so what we're doing in the reconciliation instructions is giving each one of those committees, authorizing committees, an opportunity to be able to look. Now, I will tell you that we work very hard to work with those committees and coming up with some ideas that our budget associates, which know this budget inside and out, have some recommendations, and we worked with those committee chairmen to say, here are possibilities. Some of them agreed that that's where they would go. They had other ideas about where they thought that they might be able to go to make those reforms that would actually be saving dollars.
It's a little harsh, though, I think, to try to see where those programs were worth anything by simply cutting out a lot of money. I would much rather have a good look at that program to determine whether it's worth it or not, and just cutting the money and leaving it to the committee. But I'm concerned about veterans because the way it's structured, it looks as though it would only come, that cut would only come from TRICARE and retirement benefits for the military.
Well, I will say to you that we've been very careful about making sure that the committee makes those decisions, and I think that the Veterans Services Committee, which is represented by both Republicans and Democrats, are not going to be doing things that are going to be detrimental. As a matter of fact, we have seen in this last session that we've been in for these months that we've increased those benefits to our veterans, and I think that's something that we all want to do to honor the men and women who have dedicated their lives to protecting us.
Thank you very much. I yield back.
Yes, ma'am. Thank you very much. Gentlewoman yields back time. The gentleman from Oklahoma, Distinguished Vice Chairman, Mr. Cole.
Thank you very much, and good to see two of my favorite members. I have the great privilege of serving on the Budget Committee, as does my friend, Mr. Woodall, and I always say, and I always listen to my chairman about the budget. I always listen to my chairman of the Bourbon Caucus about bourbon. So I think they both know their subjects very well.
Now I'm your sixth favorite chairman.
Yeah, well, Mr. Chairman, I'm just being polite. You
Oh,
know,
okay, okay.
Really, really.
Thank you very much for clearing that up, Tom.
But I want to begin by congratulating both of you. Look, this is by nature always somewhat partisan exercise. Doesn't matter whether the Democrats the majority or the Republicans. It's going to be the vision of the majority party. And I just think you both honestly have discharged your roles very well, and you work together well. And we do go through a deliberative process. And I've sat on both sides in the majority and in the minority in this, and it's worked that way. So, but I particularly want to commend you, Chairman, because I think this has been one of the most difficult processes. And I've never seen anybody spend more time working with the other chairman. I mean, literally reaching out beyond the Budget Committee and sitting down and talking to them. What can you really do? So that informed our deliberations. And I particularly want to commend you for keeping mandatory spending restraint alive. Look, we're all three of us, and Mr. Woodall as well, sit on that committee, and I think all four of us would agree, whatever our disagreements about this particular document, if you don't do something about entitlement spending, you'll never get to a balanced budget. That's 70% of what we do. You know, 3 programs alone, Social Security, Medicare, and Medicaid are 60%. We actually, on the Appropriations Committee, pride ourselves in trying to look after some of these priorities. We actually have increased spending for Head Start the last couple of years. We've increased spending for NIH. We've increased spending for early childhood. And you do that by prioritizing. Sometimes you have to make some tough decisions someplace else. So at least anybody think this is draconian, you've left plenty of room, I can tell you, as the subcommittee chairman on approach for labor age, for us to get our job done and take care of the people that need help. And there certainly are plenty of those people. Just for this committee, so on the, if I recall correctly, I also sit on Defense Approach. Mr. Thornberry has worked on the reforms on this idea of military retirees. This is something I take very seriously. I have a big district. My dad was a career military person. But some of the savings come because for the first time we are actually doing effectively 401ks for the military. And so we match, they put money back. Right now, only about 1 out of every 5 soldiers stays in long enough to get anything, and they don't leave with a 401k. So this actually will lower your retirement rate to some degree because there will be more that leave earlier because they can leave with something. You know, sometimes I've met any number of soldiers, and look, they are all great patriots, and they all put their country first, but they quite often serve the last 6 or 8 years to get to that check when they might want to go do something else at a younger stage in life. So this actually creates more options. It's not meant to punish anybody. And on veterans, just for the record, I think actually this is one we ought to quit fighting about and ought to congratulate one another on. We doubled veteran spending when President Bush was here. We did it again when President Obama was here. We have increased spending every single year on veterans, whether Democrats were in control or we were in control. And what I sense mostly is a bipartisan frustration that money has not always been used well by the bureaucracy at the VA. I've seen nobody, cutting back on veterans support. We like to politicize it and score points against one another, but the reality is the congressional record here is awfully clear. We spend more money on veterans, and this is a good thing about our country because it tells you what our constituents want us to do. But we spend more money on veterans than every other nation in the world combined. Not any other nation, every other nation. So while we've got our problems and difficulties here, it's one where President Bush can be proud of his record, President Obama can be proud of his record, President Trump, who ran on helping veterans, can be proud of his record, and more importantly, Congress, which actually writes the check, can be proud of its record on a bipartisan basis. So I just wanted to clear that point up. I only want to ask each of you one question, and where I have been disappointed, and I will be very honest about this, in both the last 2 presidents, I think the underlying cause of our budget deficit, again, is entitlement programs, the inability to come to grips with them, to reform them. It's one of the things, Chairman, I like that you didn't back off that fight. When I'm not so sure we'll see similar courage on the other side of the rotunda. I hope we do. But how would, number one, do you agree with that assessment that the key to getting into balance at some level is looking at these entitlement by the way, I think these reforms have to be bipartisan. Mr. Delaney and I actually have a bill to create a commission on Social Security, and I noticed him being savaged, I think, in this new quest because he happened to partner with me. We think some of that would be maybe lifting the cap and doing some other things. So it's not all a cut deal. We can get there in a variety of ways, but you'll never have the discretionary budget that we want on either side of the aisle. We want a more robust defense budget, obviously. Our friends, and I work with great Democratic members on domestic programs, have a keen compassion, and I think those are needed investments too. But at the end of the day, all of that's getting crowded out by entitlement spending, and we have not had a president in a long time that wants to call that out, and it's hard to do. I mean, but if Tip O'Neill and Ronald Reagan and Howard Baker can get it done, and they did, and extended Social Security for a generation with relatively modest changes. It wasn't even an issue in the next election after they did it. I always point out to my friends that are worried about it, Ronald Reagan carried 49 states, and Tip O'Neill stayed Speaker of the House. So it must have been pretty smart to save Social Security. I think it is very smart, and I've made this argument to the current administration. But anyway, how do you see long-term how we could get this into balance, and how do you see that we could ever get, if you agree with my analysis, Congress to focus on where the real money is, which is not nickel and diming on the appropriation side of the budget, the discretionary side, which has come down, quite frankly. We're spending less. I don't know if we are this year, but we've been spending less for years. That's why we've made progress on the deficit since 2011. But can't get there on that side of the budget. And, at least you've kept the door open, Chairman, for us to address where the real problem's at.
Thank you, Mr. Vice Chair. I appreciate the question, and it is a passion. It was what brought me here. One of the things that brought me here, beside health care, is that I saw the direction this country was going. And I look at my children, and now my grandchildren, 6 of them, adorable grandchildren, that I think, we're just going to leave you. And I wonder if when I'm sitting on that porch, we're in a rocking chair at the age of 90, that my grandchildren will be saying, Mimi, you were in Congress. Why didn't you do something about this? Now, we have the burden of what you all wouldn't do. And so that really, it concerns me very deeply that we are not being responsible in looking at 2/3 of our spending. And as you've already recommended, how can we do more on the discretionary side, which we would like to do many times, if we don't get serious about reform? And I use the word reform because I do believe that some of these things, just as you referenced about if you do the same thing the same way over and over again, you get the same results. That's the definition of insanity. And we do that. And so the 401K is a great example of how, yeah, you're going to save some money, but do you consider that cutting? I consider that reform. And that's intelligence. That's saying if we have a problem, let's look at how we can take care of that problem without doing it where it's hurtful, but it's going to be helpful. And I think that's just one example. There are other examples in there that can be had. When we reform food stamps, do we all not think that someone who is a single person and they're able-bodied, that unless there's extraordinary circumstances, that they should be working? And this is not even just about money for me. This is about dignity. Because after you ask someone, what is your name, you ask them, what do you do? I want us to not be complicit in keeping people in a situation where they feel comfortable. I want them to get out there and be the best that they can be, that all God made them to be. And yet, we want to use something where we beat each other up to say we're going to let starving children starve. None of us would want to do that. But let's look realistically at what we spend. Let's say, is this really what we should be spending? And by the way, when we look at committees or programs that have been authorized and reauthorized, I had the committee staff pull this up. I have a stack this big in 8 font, front and back page, that still have not been authorized. Some of these programs, 10 years, have not been reauthorized. Why are we not reauthorizing and looking at these programs and scrutinizing them and making sure that we're doing the right thing? And that's called reform. That's not necessarily just cutting. So I'd like to see us, in a bipartisan way, get serious about saying, look, we're all worried about where we're going eventually. 2/3 now in the mandatory side, only 1/3 left. You can take all education, transportation, commerce, and all of that away. You still can't balance the budget. So I'm just adamant that we've got to continue what we've begun this year in our conversation about getting this mandatory spending under control and our debt and deficit spending. When I came here, we were $10 trillion in debt. Today, we are $20 trillion in debt. I've been here 6.5 years. And I have a hard time going back home and telling my constituents I've done my job. So, Mr. Chairman, I and Mr. Vice Chairman and the rest of the committee, both Democrat and Republican, I just think we have got to get serious and be adults about this and stop talking about, oh, we're cutting things where people are being devastated. We're Americans. We're not going to let that happen. Let's talk about this in a way that we can acknowledge that there needs to be something done. And I believe this budget has started that conversation, and we cannot stop this conversation until it's fixed. I yield back.
Thank you, Mr. Cole, and I'll start by saying that the bourbon industry is doing so well. There are more and more choices, so...
I just want to assure my friend I'm doing my part.
And it's hard to keep track of all the new bourbons out there, I will say, but I'm also giving it my best efforts as well. I don't think anybody would disagree with your assessment of the situation. And I think part of the problem that has always hindered us is twofold. One is the programs we're talking about, for the most part, are incredibly popular. So politically, they are really the third rails. Secondly, most of the conversation has involved cuts and not raising revenue in those programs. And that's something I think has to be on the table. John Larson has a bill in to talk about reforming Social Security in that way, where you do lift the caps and actually increase the contribution. So again, a balanced discussion over revenues and expenditures is important. We obviously face a huge demographic problem. 10,000 seniors a day becoming eligible for Medicare. And that's something we can't do anything about. So we have to figure out how to accommodate that. We have to think about future generations too. Obviously, if you've made contributions into Medicare and Social Security for 30 or 40 years, it's really tough as a country to say we're going to break the contract we have with you. But we might start thinking about those who have not yet entered the system and think about whether the system is the right system for the future. Companies are doing that every day, going from defined benefit plans into defined pension plans for new hires, for instance. We have made some progress, though. Under the ACA, the growth in Medicare has dropped, the growth rate in Medicare has dropped significantly, probably about a third of what it was before the ACA. So we've extended the program. There are other things we can do on, I think, the kind of related policies. Comprehensive immigration reform has been estimated that would reduce the Social Security shortfall by 8%. It's a pretty significant hit, would also help grow the economy by as much as 5%. So that's based on the Democrats' plan from 2013, the House Democratic plan. So those are things that we can't consider in isolation, things like immigration reform, because they do have very positive implications potentially for the long-term financial situation of the country. So, but I agree with Chairman Black, things like we ought to be providing much more serious oversight on virtually everything we do. And I think there are some programs where we have backwards incentives, where we have incentives to keep people from working, and because we don't let them, we say if you earn a certain amount, then you lose these benefits. We ought to look at all of those to see if the amounts are appropriate, because we want people to work, and if they need help, we want to give them help. So, I think in this environment, it's hard to have these kind of conversations, and partially it's because the outside world makes it very difficult for us. I think a lot of us, if we sat in a room for half an hour, could probably solve a lot of these problems very amicably, but it's tough in this political environment.
I agree with both my friends in that regard, but it's absolutely imperative that we do it. And, commitment I'll make to you, because I think your diagnosis of this problem of entitlements is right, because it's actually the bad part of a good problem. The good problem is people are living a lot longer than we ever anticipated they would when we designed this. That's a happy problem to have to deal with, but that life is very expensive. It's precious, but it's expensive. And this is one where, again, we need to have people who will sit down and work across the aisle, because I think there are solutions to be had here. Look, if Ronald Reagan, Tip O'Neill, and Howard Baker can do it, within living memory, this is not something that can't be done. And if all of them could do it and not suffer political consequences, if it's done in a bipartisan way, there won't be consequences. There'll actually be a great deal of celebration that we got something done that people care about, because they care about the survival of these programs. You've been generous with your time, Mr. Chairman. I didn't mean to go on so long. I want to thank our witnesses and yield back. But I will say there's no two members that are better to work with. They really are remarkable leaders in both their parties and on this committee. Yield back.
Thank you very much, Chairman Cole, the gentleman from Massachusetts.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Thank you both for being here. Ms. Black, I'm a liberal Democrat, and I agree with you that we need to constantly review our programs to make sure they're being run effectively and efficiently. And if they don't work anymore, we need to replace them, or we need to change them, or tweak them, or whatever. I think liberals and conservatives, I would like to think we can agree that review is an important thing to do. And that is why I really am kind of really disappointed with this section on SNAP in your budget. Because I'm reading what's in the text here, and I don't know who wrote this, but it doesn't reflect reality. I sit on the Agriculture Committee. We are reviewing this program. We have done, to date, 23 hearings on SNAP. On this one program, 23 hearings. As you know, the Republicans are in charge of the Congress, so they get to call the lion's share of witnesses. We get some witnesses, too, but I don't recall any witness, Democrat or Republican witness, suggesting that there could be $154 billion worth of savings in SNAP. Then you add another $10 billion with the reconciliation instructions, so $164 billion without doing what you say you don't want to do, which is making more people hungry in this country. I mean, for example, I'm reading from the text here. It says, participation in the SNAP program has grown from 17 million Americans in 2001 to 44 million in 2016. The fact is, SNAP did grow significantly between 2007 and 2011, basically to meet the need as millions of people became eligible due to the worst economic crisis we've had since the Great Depression. in this country. And that's what SNAP is there for. It's countercyclical. When things are bad, the benefit increases to cover those who are in need. But what your finding doesn't point out is that the number of SNAP participants has fallen by more than 5.5 million people since peaking in December of 2012, due because this economy is slowly recovering. Not at the rate any of us want, but there is some recovery here, and people are getting off the benefit. So we see a decline in those who need the program. You have a finding here, it says the work support role of SNAP has declined, and the program increasingly serves as a replacement to work. I don't know where that came from, to be honest with you, because maybe you don't know this, but 67% of the people on SNAP are not expected to work. They're kids. They're senior citizens. They're people who are disabled. I mean, unless you want to repeal the child labor laws and send grandma back to the factory, I mean, these are people who are not expected to work. Of those who can work, you know, a majority of them are working, but they are earning so little that they still qualify for the program. Now, you mentioned able-bodied adults without dependents, which is now, you know, which is, I assume that's where you think all these savings are going to come from. And you say anybody who's able-bodied, you know, adult ought to be working. Well, look, here's what we have learned, is that the able-bodied adult without dependent population is not comprised of people who are just lazy and who do not want to work. They include people with limited educational experiences, with 80% having no more than a high school education or a GED. Some are just aging out of foster care. Some have underlying undiagnosed mental illnesses. As many as 60,000 are veterans. We have been hearing from veterans organizations who are very nervous about this focus on so-called ABODs because it is a growing number of them are veterans, people who are coming back and having trouble reintegrating into our community. This is a complicated population. And we already have work requirements in SNAP. There are all kinds of requirements in SNAP. In fact, for the ABOD population, right now, as a result of the welfare reform law, you can be on SNAP for 3 months. And if you are not involved in a job training program, or if you are not working, you are ineligible for that benefit for 3 years. That's already in place. Now, I don't know whether you're saying that able-bodied adults without dependents shouldn't even have 3 months, but the bottom line is where are these savings coming from? Maybe tell me how you're going to do this and not increase hunger in this country.
Thank you, Mr. McGovern, and I'm happy to try to address your questions. I'm not sure whether you're reading from the document that we have from this year. It sounds like some language maybe from last year. I'm not sure. I do want to reference in our document that.
Yeah, I'll double check. Section 518, policy statement. Anyway, go ahead.
Okay, so I do want to reference in our document that we give you all credit in your committee. As a matter of fact, we have in here during the 114th Congress, the Agriculture Committee held 16 hearings. We acknowledge that, examining the past, present, and future SNAP, and reported 15 key findings in 2016. So I want you to know we're acknowledging the good work that you're doing. We're supporting the fact that there is still work to be done. And I can tell you in my own state of Tennessee that I am told by employers consistently that we have folks coming into their place of business and saying, do you have jobs available? And if they say yes, then they turn around and they walk out the door. But if they say no, they want them to sign a piece of paper to show that there are no jobs available. Job shopping so that they can continue. Now, I'm not saying everybody that's on food stamps is that way. That I'm not saying. I want to make that very, very, very clear. I've spent my life making sure that we take care of those of the underserved, and I want to continue to do that. But I want to look back at what was done back during President Clinton in the reform of entitlements and what it did for the economy and what it did for individuals and their dignity. And that's really where we're trying to head, is to get people out of this situation, as you've talked about the increase in the numbers over the years, and get them into a situation where they have a transition into independence. And for me, and again, it's a dignity. It's not a dollar
And none of,
saving.
and
It
none
is
of
a
us disagree
dignity.
with that. But we talk about the dignity of work. When somebody works, they ought not to have to be in poverty. And as I said, you know, the majority of people who are able to work, who are on SNAP right now, are working. I think they're owed more dignity than to be able to work at a job that pays them so little that they still have to rely on SNAP. And quite frankly, one of the reasons why we're told why many people are not working, can't get a job or not in a job training program, is because a lot of them live in rural areas and they don't have access to transportation. And they may not have access to a job. And by the way, I neglected to add that one of the reasons why the number of people on SNAP has declined is because we have basically thrown a whole bunch of people off the program when we basically said to governors, no more waivers in terms of the able-bodied adults without dependents. And so many of them were just thrown off the program, and we have no idea. We have no idea what their situation is right now. But if you really want to help people get to work, and this is one of the things we learned in our hearing, then fully fund job training programs so that states have to guarantee people a slot in a job training program. I mean, we all talk about these wraparound services, but we don't want to fund the wraparound services. But all I am telling you, with respect, is that a cut of $154 billion plus $10 billion in reconciliation restrictions, doing that, and by the way, I'm just told, I was reading from the right budget resolution, so I was correct. But doing that is going to, there's no way that people aren't going to be hurt. And I don't know whether do you know what the average SNAP benefit is? It's $1.40 per person per meal. This notion that people are just, you know, kind of dying to get on SNAP. They want to be poor enough to be able to get a $1.40, you know, per person per meal kind of benefit. I find degrading to people who are really trying to struggle to make ends meet. You can't even buy a cup of coffee for $1.40 now. And that's why if you talk to your food banks in any one of our states, they will tell you that, you know, that they're filled with people, especially toward the end of the month, because people's SNAP benefits have run out. So, I know it's become fashionable to kind of pick on this program as, you know, as it's become everybody's favorite piñata, or it's been used as an ATM machine to fund all these other programs. But I have to tell you, the program, what we learned from our hearings is that the benefit in this program right now is inadequate. People cannot live, this is not even a supplement for people to live on. And again, that's why I said in the beginning, to me it's offensive to see a budget where so much is coming out of a program that helps the neediest in this country. I believe that food ought to be a fundamental right for everybody in America. I don't think anybody should go hungry. There are 42 million people in this country who are hungry, and I think we all should be ashamed of that fact. But this, I think of all, there's lots of things in this budget that I have problems with, but to me, this is particularly egregious. So anyway, I wanted to say that because, I'll have more to say on this during the debate on the floor tomorrow, but this is just wrong. And we all have to stop, you know, picking on people who are poor, who are who are just trying to put food on the table for their kids. I've sat down with SNAP recipients. I've met with people in food banks. I have sat in emergency rooms in hospitals with people who are on this benefit. I mean, I will tell you, this is, it's no picnic. It is very, very difficult. And I think as a nation, we ought to be doing better, but certainly we shouldn't be looking for savings of this amount to pay for a tax cut that will benefit mostly wealthy families. So I thank you both for being here. I yield back my time.
Gentleman yields back his time. Thank you very much. The gentleman from Alabama, Mr. Byrne.
Just a few questions. Madam Chairman, right now the federal debt is $20 trillion. If we do nothing, how long will it take for us to get to $30 trillion?
Our estimate, and when we project out, would be about 8.5 years before we would double our debt again.
Double.
Even
So that's
double.
40
No,
trillion.
excuse me, that we would add an additional $10 billion.
So where does it end? I'm afraid that it ends when the creditors around the world say, we're not going to buy your securities anymore because we don't think you can pay it back. And doesn't that put us in somewhat of the same position as countries like Greece or, God forbid, Venezuela?
You are correct. I think that is instructive to look at what happens in countries that ignore where we're going. And that also is not even considering the fact that if our interest rates start to rise, that all of this will become more of a crisis quicker.
Right. And so I guess one solution would be to raise taxes. But the solution that you've chosen, as I understand what your bill does, is it's twofold. Number one, it takes some hard decisions, but some serious reforms in where the real growth is in federal spending, which is means-tested entitlement programs. At the same time, it puts instructions in there for us to engage in serious tax reform to spur the American economy. And as you have more growth, you produce more revenue for the budget. That right? That a pretty good sum of it?
I think that's the sum of it.
Well, Mr. Chairman, I just got to say I appreciate the hard work that this committee does. The chairman and I have had many conversations about it, and I know that she has worked very hard to get us to this point. And I know that there are probably some things in here that if it were strictly up to you, they'd be done different. But in order to get to a result, and get to a result that balances the budget, stops adding to the debt, and even begins a small effort to pay it down, that's a hard job, and you did it. And I think for the rest of us, we should follow your lead, vote for your budget, engage in serious tax reform, grow the American economy, and then these people who need better jobs, and I'm the first to acknowledge there are people out there who are working who need better jobs and aren't making enough of what they're doing. They're working hard, they're not making enough. We improve the economy, those jobs will be there for them. And they won't need food stamps anymore. They won't need the government anymore, and I can't think of a better gift to give to somebody than the fact that they can take care of themselves. They don't need the government anymore. So thank you for your work product. I look forward to voting for it on the floor, and I yield back, Mr. Chairman.
Thank you very much, gentleman. It goes back this time. The gentleman from Florida, Judge Hastings.
Thank you very much, Mr. Chairman, and I'll thank both of the witnesses who are extremely competent and thoughtful people and come at this from hard work themselves with an understanding that may have some differences about where we go in the future. My friend from Alabama just referenced the deficit, and I ask you, Mr. Yarmouth, does the measure as offered here, which is a budget that's teeing up so-called tax reform, does it reduce the deficit?
No, Mr. Hastings, actually, it raises the debt by a significant amount. It only balances in the last year of the 10-year window. So there'll be considerable addition to the national debt if this budget were actually implemented. But furthermore, the way the budget was constructed, there are two very fundamental problems with the assumptions that are made. One is it provides for a revenue-neutral tax cut, which I don't think anybody on the Republican side is now claiming this would be. But the budget assumes a revenue-neutral tax cut, then says that projects an economic bonanza as a result of that revenue-neutral tax cut of over $1 trillion.
Right.
So, and then it assumes that the Affordable Care Act would be repealed, so it saves all the money that would be spent on the Affordable Care Act.
Well,
So you have three basic assumptions, and these are huge numbers that they put into this, they use in constructing this budget that gets it even to a balance in the 10th year. But the short and sweet answer is yes, there'll be significant addition to the debt during the 10-year window under this budget.
And continuing my questioning of you, Mr. Yarma, who gets the larger percentage of the tax cuts in this measure?
All right, well, under the budget resolution, there's no way to know that because there are no details as to what kind of a revenue-neutral tax program would actually be implemented. It just says there would be a revenue-neutral tax reform proposal, which then will actually generate additional economic growth. Again, as we've talked earlier in this hearing, there's no historical evidence to show that that would happen. So I can't tell. Now, the budget outline that has been offered by the Republicans, that this is all a course onto, would benefit significantly. The 50% of the benefit would go to the top 1%. By some analysis, it's clear that there would be people like President Trump who said that this wouldn't help him. Tax Policy Center, taking his financial disclosures, said he would save $76 million a year based on the Republican proposal. I'm not nearly as wealthy as President Trump. I do very well. It would save me $100,000 a year. I don't need the $100,000.
And
I might have fun with it, but I'm not going to create a single job because somebody gives me $100,000
That is an
back.
incredibly good point with reference to taxes overall. Most people who are well off are not knocking our doors down saying, change my taxes. I cite all the time here the 4 billionaires that I've known. None of them have ever even hinted at being concerned about taxes. As a matter of fact, one, Grover Connell, said to me more times than a little bit, you all go down there and make laws. I made money during the Depression. I made money after the Depression. I made money during the Second World War. I made money after the Second World War. And I continue to make money because I know how to, and your tax measures aren't going to impact me. And if anything, you could ask me for more if you would do something about education in this country. That's just one individual, and I won't go through.
Can I make one additional comment? Because part of this is lowering the corporate tax rate. And one of the claims and beliefs of the Republicans is that when you lower corporate rate, it will create more jobs and more investment. A study done of 90 Fortune 500 companies which pay 20% or less in income tax showed that they actually reduced employment. They increased dividends to investors, but they reduced employment. So there's a considerable amount of evidence out there right now that if you just cut the corporate tax rate, it is not going to result in job growth for the American people.
And that's a common sense approach. Corporations don't have consciences, and their bottom line is what they're looking at. So the more money that they can accumulate within the framework of their corporation, the likelihood is those that are invested are going to receive dividends. I don't see that as offensive. I also find it anathema to continue to hammer on the wealthy. If asked, and if there were hearings and we had 100 millionaires and 10 billionaires there, not a doggone one of them would likely say, hey, I gotta have these tax cuts. But we don't do that. On the other hand, we don't have the poor people there either at these hearings saying substantially what their needs are. Ms. Black, Madam Chair, I do have one question that is very concerning to me, and that is the subject of education. Your budget claims to create opportunity for all Americans by increasing access to high-quality education. Yet your budget proposes to cut programs by $320 billion over 10 years, largely in programs that allow for increased access to education. So my question is, how can your budget increase access to education while cutting the very programs that provide that access?
Mr. Hastings, as I have indicated previously, and what we have done in working with the authorizing committees is to ask them to go back and look at areas where they might be able to reform, some ways that they could say, here are some dollars that we could save by reform. And that is what we worked with the chairman of education for her to look at, the programs that are within her jurisdiction. And she is the one who identifies the programs. I have trust in the committees making those decisions, and this is in their jurisdiction, and so it is up to them to tell us what it is that they believe is appropriate reform.
So appropriate reform came to the amount of money that I just talked about in cutting education.
The chairman believes that there is an opportunity to be able to make those reforms and to save those dollars.
Well, Dr. Fox served here with us. I have great respect for her, and she being an educator, I would assume that that's the case. Mr. Chairman, I wanted to say to you, when you were offering up your statements about Dallas and the state of Texas, I just am curious. I don't need a response, but I wonder, when you are factoring how wonderful things are you factoring in the fact that you're blessed by having oil patches and considerable amounts of oil, the same as other areas of our country are sometimes fortunate in that regard. But Ms. Black, you're going to be running for governor of the state that I spent a lot of time in, 5 years of my life in Tennessee and college. And I like that state. I wish you well in your endeavor. But I'm curious, a gentleman that served here with you and I, and Chairman Sessions and Ms. Slaughter, Sam Brownback, went on to become senator and then governor of Kansas. And I'm just curious if any of Kansas's circumstances where tax cuts reigned supreme inform any of your decisions in the budget with reference to all of this money, when taxes are cut, are going to benefit the citizenry. And I do believe that you would believe, as do I, that Kansas has been a failure in that regard.
Mr. Hastings, I will admit to you very rapidly that I will not make a statement on what's going on in Kansas unless I studied it.
Yeah.
And I have not had the opportunity to study what's going on in
Well, we all
Kansas.
did Alice in Wonderland
So,
at some point.
I
We
will
know where
say to
Dorothy
you,
was.
I will say this to you, however, as I'm very proud to be a Tennessean, where we had a $2 billion over-collection last year. We're 49th in the nation in per capita tax burden on our citizens, and we are doing very well in our state. We have no oil in our state, and we don't live on an ocean, so we're kind of stuck there in the middle, and I'm proud of what we've been able to do there in the state of
All right,
Tennessee.
and you just raised another question. When the budget proposal was set forth and the time for this particular hearing was done, pretty obviously, we do supplementals around here, but obviously you could not have taken into consideration the number of disasters that have occurred in the country. Am I correct? So this budget doesn't contemplate anything to do with Texas, Puerto Rico, the Virgin Islands, Florida, or, and I continue to tell my colleagues this, the 26 other disasters that FEMA, for one, and other agencies are handling in this nation as we speak.
No, sir, it does not.
All right. Now, your budget assumes both repeal and replacement of the Affordable Care Act. And it is in your committee's report, the language in Report 115-240, starting on page 44, says this: the Budget Committee assumes the enactment of its pro-growth policies, including comprehensive tax reform and welfare reform, the budget's spending restraint, the administration's regulatory reforms, and Obamacare repeal and replace legislation. And then on page 49, your committee wrote, the Budget Committee estimates that under the pro-growth policies in this year's House budget resolution, including Obamacare repeal and replace legislation, comprehensive tax reform, welfare reform, net deficit reduction of $5 trillion from spending restraint. And on page 12, you say this resolution assumes enactment of the American Health Care Act recently passed by the House. Now, end the quote there, recently passed by the House. I remind you that your bill barely passed the House, and that was before we had a final CBO score. I'm not so sure that it'll pass today if you brought it up again, but please help me understand this. You assume repeal and replacement of Obamacare. And I know you know what has happened in the Senate, and I need not point out the awesomeness of Senator McCain's traveling the country after brain surgery to vote against what was then known as the skinny bill. That bill didn't even make it to a vote, the next one, Graham Cassidy, because people recognized that it wasn't going anywhere and didn't have a chance. Now, according to Politico, and I have the article here, and I don't consider any of these places to be the Bible, but I do ask unanimous consent, Mr. Chairman, to insert the Politico article into the record, and I'll come up with...
Without objection.
Thank you so much. According to them, there's a copy. You jammed a bill through the House without waiting for nonpartisan analysis of cost and impact. The repeal effort has repeatedly failed in the Senate, and the majority of the public seems to oppose the repeal and replace strategy. Yet you still assume passage of repeal and replace. And so my question is, specifically, what facts are you using to assume enactment of repeal and replace? And how in the world could you come to that assumption based on the history of now on to 60-plus votes that have failed to repeal Obamacare?
Well, Mr. Hastings, as you know, this document was voted on in July before the Senate did not do their work in repealing and replacing. And so it still is a fundamental goal of our conference to help the American people by giving them relief, to take them out from underneath of a bill that has not worked. And so it is still our, and of course, when this passed, it was our vision then. It still is our vision now. We are in hopes that at some point the Senate is going to take this up and do something to help the American people who need this help. And so it is a part of our document. As you know, this document will then stand as a negotiating document when we go into a conference committee with the Senate. But our bill does assume what our conference envisioned and what our conference supported.
Well, good luck with that, because you haven't been able to repeal it thus far, and making the assumptions that you did, I can readily understand if you want to try to get to what's going to be needed. But just a couple of things, and I hear the argument about slowing growth, reviewing things that may or may not have worked, but I do want to piggyback off of my colleague and good friend Jim McGovern about his anecdotal information of people that he has sat with and talked to that are suffering. It's not a lost number that a number of people in this country do not have enough food. I represent an area, Ms. Black and Mr. Yama, a little school that I'm so proud of called Wynwood. It's a totally diverse school, about a third African American, a third white, and a third Hispanic. And they have been in a school since Florida rates their schools, now coming up on 12 years. 90% of the children in that school receive 2 meals at that school. 75% of all of their parents are working, and 50% of them are eligible for SNAP. Now, that's one little isolated situation that could extrapolate perhaps to a lot of rural areas, and this is not in a rural area, it's in Palm Beach County. And yet, we find ourselves cutting programs from nutrition assistance, or however you name it. We're taking funding from community block grants, and I don't believe you in Tennessee or Mr. Yarmouth in Kentucky or any member of this committee has not had people from representatives of government at city commissions and county commissions and whatever our jurisdictions are that have told us how important the community block grant program is for them to meet such, again, referring to SNAP programs as Meals on Wheels or community infrastructure programs, and yet we cut money from that program. $254 million in transportation spending is not going to be made available for 10 years. And I, for one, think and thought that we should have raised the gas tax, and I don't know why people around here can't say those words. I remember when the transportation secretary under the Obama administration came to our transportation hub, Anthony Fox, he was a former mayor in Charlotte, and he came down there, and 3 of us Congress people and all of the people around, everybody, all the air went out of the room when I said that we needed to increase the gas tax. We needed to, and we still need to, in an effort to raise revenue. We don't need to do an estate tax cut. It will damage this economy. And we could do some things. If we wanted to really right all of this, 3 years of 5% across the board, everything, including us in the legislature, if we were to do that for 3 years, we'd balance the budget. And that would be everybody sacrificing. But you see, we don't want to do that. This particular measure is going to, once tax reform really starts, or tax cuts, it's going to bring in the realtors who are going to have an awful lot to say to all of us. And yet, we find ourselves in financial aid programs for higher ed. Your budget calls for $211 million to be cut. $50 billion in, Ms. Slaughter brought it out earlier, in mandatory veterans benefits, which once they learn, I guess they'll be here. I could go on, but I want to stop with the gentleman who inserted himself on September 28th into this discussion in an article in the Washington Post. He's been referred to earlier, Mr. Bruce Bartlett. He was the domestic policy advisor to President Reagan and is the author of The Benefit and the Burden Tax Reform, Why We Need It and What It Will Take. I ask unanimous consent that this article be placed in the record, Mr. Chairman.
Without objection.
I will not read it all. He worked with Jack Kemp, who I knew, and probably, Chairman, you did. I don't know, Jim, whether you did, but I knew Jack Kemp and had great admiration for many of his thoughts about what should happen in our respective communities, particularly as it pertains to housing. I was practicing law when I met him. But Mr. Bartlett worked with him. I didn't know Mr. Bartlett, still don't. He says the tax system, by the time Ronald Reagan was president, Republican tax gospel went something like this. The tax system has an enormously powerful effect on economic growth and employment. High taxes and tax rates were largely responsible for stagflation in the 70s. And Reagan's 1981 tax cut, which was based a bill co-sponsored by Kemp and Senator William Roth that I helped design, Mr. Bartlett, unleashed the American economy and led to an abundance of growth. He said, based on this logic, tax cuts became the GOP's go-to solution for nearly every economic problem. Extravagant claims are made for any proposed tax cut. Wednesday this was September 28th when he wrote it, President Trump argued that our country and our economy cannot take off without the kind of tax reform he proposes. And last week, again, September 28th was when he wrote it, Arthur Laffer said, if you cut the corporate tax rate to 15%, it will pay for itself many times over. This will bring in approximately $1.5 trillion net by itself. Mr. Bartlett says, that's wishful thinking. So is most Republican rhetoric around tax cutting. In reality, there's no evidence that a tax cut now will spur growth. He goes on to say, the Reagan tax cut did have a positive effect on the economy, but the prosperity of the 80s is overrated in the Republican mind. In fact, aggregate real gross domestic product growth was higher in the 70s, 37.2% versus 35.9%. Moreover, GOP tax methodology usually leaves out other factors that also contributed to growth in the 80s. First was the sharp reduction in interest rates by the Federal Reserve. The Fed funds rate fell by more than half, from about 19% in July 1981 to about 9% in November 82. Second, Reagan's defense buildup and highway construction programs greatly increased the federal government's purchases of goods and services. And this is textbook, according to him, Keynesian economics. He said third was a simple bounce back from the recession. Recoveries in the post-war era tended to be V-shaped. They were as sharp as the downturn they followed. The deeper the recession, the more robust the recovery. And then something that I think needs to be said over and over for my friends who cite to Ronald Reagan all the time. Finally, I'm not sure how many Republicans even know anymore that Reagan raised taxes several times after 1981. His last budget showed that as of 1988, the aggregate cumulative revenue loss from the 1981 tax cut was $264 billion, and legislated tax increases brought about half of that back. I'll conclude with yet another paragraph. He says, rushing through a half-baked tax plan in the same manner Republicans tried and failed to do with health care reform should be rejected out of hand. As Senator John McCain has repeatedly and correctly said, and so has Al C. Hastings, and so has Robert Woodall on this committee, successful legislating requires a return to the regular order. That means a detailed proposal with proper revenue estimates and distribution tables, which we haven't seen here, or may see soon or at some point, from the Joint Committee on Taxation. It requires hearings and analysis by the nation's best tax experts, markups and amendments in the tax writing committees, and an open process in the House of Representatives and Senate. Now, I can tell you that we are beginning the process here, and there's a lot more that all of us are going to be saying over time. But we do our nation a terrible disservice when we cut $10 billion from agriculture, $1 billion from armed services, $20 billion from education and workforce, $20 billion from energy and commerce, financial services, $14 billion, homeland security, $3 billion, judiciary, $45 billion, natural resources, $5 billion, oversight in government, $32 billion, Veterans Affairs, $1 billion, Ways and Means, $52 billion, and I know we left out the legislative branch, but I guess the fact that we haven't had a raise in 11 years ourselves caused us to kind of ignore that, or that our MRA has been cut by $275,000 over 3 years. I guess that was a legitimate leave-out. But let me go on record saying that I favor in many respects, that all of us, I'm a single man, children grown, mama dead, I've managed to get by on whatever it is here. But last year, I paid $38,000 in taxes because I don't have any deductions, investments, and all of that kind of stuff. I'm talking about me. I paid $38,000. The year before that, $36,000. Coming up real soon, it's going to be virtually the same amount. But you know something? If I thought we were going to help poor people, and if I thought the middle class was really going to benefit, then I would be willing to pay more taxes. And I believe more people in this country have a similar feeling. And I leave it with that, with an understanding that I don't think the nerve exists in this Congress to find 50 other people that say that we need tax increases in an appropriate manner. And if we wanted to deal with the entitlements, we would be fair-minded. Anybody in here, please tell me what somebody that has $100 million, that's 70 years old, needs with Social Security. What do they need it for? They don't need it for anything at all. But at the same time, we won't get into that because we're talking about people. And if you would have asked some of them, I know 4 or 5 millionaires, you ask them the question about Social Security, say, what do you need it for? I earned it, they say. And then they go to the liquor store to cash the Social Security check or make it play money at the gambling institutions. We need to start talking real talk around here, with or without bourbon, Mr. Yarmouth. Mostly with. I yield
Mostly
back.
with.
Gentleman yields back his time. The gentleman from Georgia, Mr. Collins. Mr. Collins does not seek time. Well, I'm left. Good document. The concurrent resolution on the budget fiscal year 2018. My review, my little homework that I did, page 218. You don't have to look at it, but I'll tell you what you already know. Improper payments by federal government programs totaled in 2016, $144.3 billion. I quote out of page 219 from the chairwoman of the committee. Many agencies seem to be following a pay and chase model for addressing improper payments. The agencies focus on getting the checks out the door only to determine after the fact that many were improper. This determination sparks a laborious and sometimes costly process in recouping such payment. GAO believes one key to curbing improper payments is to prevent them from being made in the first place. Goes on to say at the end of that paragraph, GAO has made nearly 130 recommendations over the past 5 years that various agencies have not fully acted upon. I think you're being generous to say they acted at all, but I quoted your document. Shame on us. The gentleman from Colorado seek time.
I do.
The gentleman's recognized.
I wanted to ask Mr. Yarmouth if you can describe how the Democratic budget uses immigration reform to reduce our budget deficit.
Well, thank you, Mr. Polis. What we assume in the Democratic budget is or it's based on, is the enactment of the Border Security, Economic Opportunity, and Immigration Modernization Act that House Democrats offered in the 113th Congress. We believe that fixing the country's broken immigration system will mean safer communities, a stronger economy, and lower budget deficits. As I mentioned earlier in the hearing, this would have a significant positive impact on the deficit and the economy. The CBO estimated that that bill in the 113th Congress would have reduced the deficit by $900 billion over the next 2 decades, would have boosted the economy by 5.4%, and increased productivity by 1%. A significant positive increase. And also with regard to Social Security, which is how I discussed it before, would reduce the shortfall in Social Security by 8% and extend the Social Security Trust Fund by 2 years.
And you mentioned, I think, several decades. What is the 10-year scoring for for fixing the immigration problem?
I'm not sure about, I'll have to get that for you.
Okay. So if we include the immigration reform in the budget and we adopt this budget, it means it would just need the 51 votes in the Senate then? Is that the benefit of doing it through reconciliation?
That's correct.
So if we can pass this budget, it would make immigration reform easier because traditionally they needed 60 votes. I think last time they did have 60 votes for it actually in the Senate. It was the House that never considered it.
Right.
But I think what you're saying is this would also reduce the deficit substantially if we're able to get it done.
Yep. That's correct.
Okay, and when we pass the I'd like to be optimist, so I say when we pass the Democratic budget, we would likely then proceed with reconciliation bill with regard to immigration reform?
Would certainly be appropriate, I believe.
Well, it's a good reason to pass a Democratic budget. I yield back.
Gentleman yields back his time. Is there any other member that would seek time with this first panel? I want to thank both of you. Chairwoman, Mr. May has spent a great deal of time, I think, trying to gather together stories that would be told properly. It is my hope that Mr. May will look to me as a person who I'd like to work with him to bring to fruition every positive attribute that is in here. He's a friend, I've known him for a number of years, and I appreciate his document preparation and the meticulous amount of specific detail that you have provided, and would like to thank the gentleman for a job well done. Mr. Chairman, thank you very much. We look forward to seeing you again, and if you'll please remember anything you brought in writing that you provided as testimony, if you'll please make sure that our awesome stenographer has an opportunity to get that before you leave. Thank you very much. Okay, this finishes the first panel. We believe that we have several other witnesses who would make themselves available. Ms. Schakowsky, I know, has been sitting here. I know that the gentleman, Mr. Bobby Scott, is reportedly close, and Mr. Glenn Grothman, the gentleman from Wisconsin, will be available. So we will point them out. We may have to point him out. Mr. Scott, I'm delighted that you're here. We will move forward with you and your testimony, hoping that the gentlewoman, Mrs. Schakowsky, who has literally been here for some period of time, but would know that she would be welcome to come back. Mr. Grothman is going to walk through the door any second and join us. And so we will keep going. And when Mrs. Schakowsky comes, I'd like to ask the clerk, Ms. Booth, if she would please make sure that Ms. Schakowsky joins this first panel. Gentlemen, thank you for being here today. You know that what we're taking testimonies, H-Con Res 71. Both of you, or all three of you, as we're joined by Ms. Schakowsky, anything you bring in writing will be entered in the record without objection. We're going to move forward. The gentleman, Mr. Scott's now recognized.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. I thank you for your traditional hospitality. Mr. Chairman, Ranking Member Slaughter, and other members of the committee, I'm testifying on behalf of the Congressional Black Caucus Alternative Budget. And the nation's budget reflects, as you've heard many times, reflects priorities, but the budget offered by the Republican majority for consideration this week continues to highlight the wrong priorities. The CBC is again offering a budget that I think reflects better priorities. Our budget is in stark contrast with the Republican budget, which balances on the backs of our nation's most vulnerable communities. Their budget leaves hardworking American families out in the cold. It fast-tracks tax cuts for the wealthiest Americans while claiming that unrealistic economic growth will pay for these contacts, when in reality, they will ultimately be paid for by gutting the social safety net. It cuts $1.5 trillion from Medicaid and Medicare. It also cuts programs that support basic living standards, including nutrition assistance. It undermines the national security by cutting diplomatic programs and foreign aid. The Republican budget would severely harm programs that keep Americans competitive around the world, by cutting education, job training, domestic manufacturing, advanced research and development, and infrastructure. The Republican budget is not a workable plan. It contains trillions of dollars in largely unpaid for in a largely unpaid for tax reform plan that would cut taxes for the highest earners and then cut spending in a way that, if enacted, would hurt working families. And as it's been pointed out, none of it is paid for. On the other hand, the CBC budget is compassionate. The numbers add up and addresses the needs of the most vulnerable and improves our economy. Unlike the Republican budget, the CBC budget uses real numbers, not overly optimistic assumptions and asterisks. Our budget reduces the deficit, but not on the backs of our most vulnerable communities. Our budget calls for a comprehensive job program that will grow the economy and create millions of new jobs. Most importantly, our budget protects and strengthens the social safety net and recommits the federal government to eradicating poverty in America by increasing economic opportunity through robust targeting investments in education, infrastructure, affordable housing, domestic manufacturing, small business, advanced research and development, and job training. All of our policy proposals and assumptions are paid for through a $3.9 trillion enhancement in revenues. And unlike the Republican budget, we show how Congress can realistically reach this budget by outlining $10.9 trillion in revenue options that Congress can find $3.9 trillion in. With additional revenue, the CBC budget proposes a comprehensive infrastructure and jobs program totaling $1 trillion over 5 years that will accelerate our economic recovery and ensure that it reaches every community in America, while also investing in what we know will guarantee long-term competitiveness. Additionally, the CBC budget includes approximately $300 billion for significant and sustained investments in programs that have been instrumental in lifting millions of Americans out of poverty. And to ensure that our limited federal resources are targeted most efficiently, the CBC proposal codifies the 10-20-30 spending program that requires 10% of the federal funds in certain accounts to be dedicated to areas that have had a poverty rate of 20% for over 30 years. It addresses two looming crises that we're going to have to deal with, one by allocating $200 billion for hurricane relief and $100 billion for the pension crisis. Many pension programs are about to go broke, and if we don't come up with some solutions that will cost money, a lot of millions of Americans will be left out in the cold. Finally, the CBC budget eliminates any further threat of sequestration, which will haphazardly cut critical investments across the board in January if the Republican budget is adopted. Even with the elimination of sequester and strong investments in programs that we know will actually create millions of new jobs and economic opportunity, the CBC budget is still estimated to reduce the deficit when compared to CBO's baseline by approximately $2.5 trillion over 10 years. Mr. Chairman, we use the basis of our budget is arithmetic, not unrealistic estimates and fairy dust. And so I think the $2.5 million is consistent with arithmetic, and I would hope you would adopt the alternative rather than the underlying Republican budget. Yield back.
Mr. Scott, thank you very much. Might get your wish. We're delighted, Ms. Schakowsky, that you are here. You have taken time to join us this afternoon. You've heard much of the testimony that's been offered, and we're delighted that you were here. Mr. Grothman's going to share his microphone with you, and we'll let you go ahead and have your time to give testimony as you choose.
Well, thank you very much, Mr. Chairman. And Ranking Member Slaughter, I want to thank you for the opportunity to testify today. As a member of the Congressional Progressive Caucus, that's CPC, I'm on the Budget Task Force. It's my honor to present the People's Budget as a substitute amendment to FY 2018 budget resolution. Budgets, as we know, are about priorities. And we think the Republican budget resolution has the wrong priorities. It proposes cutting taxes for the wealthy and corporations while cutting healthcare, research, education, environmental protection, infrastructure, economic development, and job training for everyone else. Instead of solving the problems facing working families, it makes those problems worse. The Republican budget doesn't create jobs through bold investment in infrastructure, and it does nothing to lower the cost of prescription drugs or improve health care or improve retirement security. The CPC People's Budget provides an alternative path. It reinvests in America through infrastructure, education, and wage growth to help Americans achieve the American dream. According to an analysis by the Economic Policy Institute, the People's Budget would create 2.4 million jobs while at the same time trimming the deficit by over $4 trillion. It starts with a bold $2 trillion investment in infrastructure. This plan for a 21st century New Deal will upgrade our transportation system, improve the safety of our drinking water, and transform our energy infrastructure. And it will create millions of quality American jobs. The People's Budget invests in education, from expanding pre-K to providing debt-free college. Unlike the Republican budget, the People's Budget prioritizes American health care above tax cuts for the wealthy. It proposes improvements to the Affordable Care Act, including a public option and lower prices for prescription drugs. It includes expanded access to mental health care and treatment for substance abuse and opioid addiction, a major crisis affecting communities across the country. The People's Budget gives our economy an additional boost by repairing our broken immigration system. That includes passage of the DREAM Act and prohibiting funding of immigration bans on Muslims or refugees. It also takes action to address the threat of climate change and provides $200 billion in assistance for the communities in Texas, Florida, Puerto Rico, and the U.S. Virgin Islands devastated by recent hurricanes. President Trump and told Puerto Ricans today that addressing that humanitarian crisis has, quote, thrown our budget a little out of whack, unquote. In contrast, the People's Budget provides for disaster assistance and invests in pre-disaster mitigation. So how can we afford all this? Well, we live in the richest country in the world, at the richest moment in history. Most people, if you ask them, wouldn't feel that. That's because we need to ask the wealthiest Americans, to whom most of the benefits have gone, and the largest corporations to pay their fair share of taxes. Republicans have proposed trillions of dollars in tax cuts, 80% of which go to the top 1%. In fact, 30% of middle-class families making $50,000 to $150,000 would see a tax increase under their proposal, according to the Tax Policy Center. The People's Budget proposes a fair tax system that works for working families. It raises taxes on millionaires and billionaires, stops incentive for offshoring, and makes multinational corporations pay the tax they owe on $2.6 trillion in profits stashed abroad. Through a fair tax system, we can invest in a world-class transportation system, safe drinking water, clean energy, and debt-free college while protecting Medicare, Medicaid, and Social Security for future generations. The People's Budget provides a bold, progressive vision for our country, creates jobs, reducing inequality, and preparing for the future. Thank you, Mr. Chairman.
Mr. Kowski, thank you very much. Ms. Grothman, welcome to the Rules Committee. I have looked at your amendment with lots of respect. You, so to speak, put your money where your mouth is. Gentleman's recognized.
Good. Well, I always love to go before the Rules Committee. I always got to think up some reason to talk to you guys. We'll read them through here. What the budget's really normally about is discretionary spending, and this should be considered a little bit of an embarrassment for Republicans. If you look at this budget, the total amount of discretionary spending is going about 4%, which and by discretionary spending, I mean not the supplementals, just comparing discretionary spending one budget over the other. That's the second highest amount we've had since Obama's first year, so we're not exactly draining the swamp. It's also about $76 billion more than Donald Trump proposed himself, and I think we'd be a little bit concerned when Congress goes $76 billion over what Trump wanted. We do know that this is a negotiating document. We eventually be in negotiating the budget with the Senate or eventually an omnibus bill, which is the end product here. We are in a negotiating position. The Senate's going to make it worse. So I wouldn't be surprised. I'd be shocked, quite frankly, if by the time we got done with this process, we had the biggest increase in discretionary spending since Obama's first year. And that's not what people elected Republicans to do. And again, that's not taking into account supplementals. I assume we'll be spending more on flood bills in the future. In response to this spending, the committee decided to put in $200 billion in mandatory cuts over the next 10 years. Now, we know human nature being what human nature is. That won't be $20 billion in the first year. It'll probably be under $10 billion in the first year, and most in the out years, whether it will maybe happen, maybe not. The budget amount is about 1.6% of mandatory spending if we take out Medicare or Social Security. What the amendment does, it goes up from $200 to $400 billion. We haven't addressed mandatory spending in a long period of time. I don't think 3.2% reduction in mandatory spending is out of line. And I want you folks to think, when they get done pushing the pencil on the omnibus bill that's going to pass in December, when I assume it'll probably pass, when the numbers finally come out, and it turns out that this Republican conference and Republican president and such had a spending increase in discretionary that was the highest since Obama's first year. And when I talk to people back home, they have a hard time swallowing that and wonder what's going to happen. But I'm afraid that's what we're going to wind up with. I realize there's a budget out there with even greater mandatory cuts. That's the RSC budget. I maybe should have waited more, but I would say the RSC budget is maybe a politically unrealistic budget for many of our members to take. I don't think voting for $400 billion over 10 years in in mandatory spending is a difficult thing for our members to take. It's something we should be able to get behind, and I like to introduce realistic things. I realize it's not an overall substitute, but I would like to give people on the floor, first of all, an opportunity to maybe win, and if not win, give them an opportunity to say they're a little bit disappointed that we aren't a little more frugal than I think our constituents would have expected us to be, given the difficult financial situation we're in. Thank you for having me.
Yes, sir. I think I've got a question for you. Was there an increase in 2013, 14, 15, 16, 17?
For several years, no, there was not an increase. Other years that there was an increase. I think the only year, right now we're talking about like a 4% upper. The only year I think we had an equivalent upper in discretionary spending to take out the supplementals was in 16. Actually, in a lot of those years, because of the caps, we even had cuts.
So any increase, even de minimis, would be an increase.
I'd have to go through them.
But I mean, based upon your testimony, I'm just saying if most years there was not even an increase, any increase, even de minimis, would be an increase.
Right, but I think 4% is.
I think fair. So what is the dollar increase, 18 discretion over 17 discretion that's proposed?
Oh, I got all my numbers here. About $46 billion.
46B. And do you have reasons to believe that that happened in defense?
Oh, the bulk of it is defense. Remember, all of it's defense.
Okay. So that's the story that's fair to tell, too. The gentleman from Georgia.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Glenn and I get to serve together on the Budget Committee, and to his point, the entire delta between what Diane Black was proposing as chairwoman of the committee and what John Yarmouth was proposing as the ranking member of the committee was about $4 trillion over 10 years. The entire delta between Republicans and Democrats was $4 trillion. Because of what Glenn is pointing at, where we have failed to take steps when we had an opportunity to take steps, we're going to spend $5 trillion in interest over that same period. But for mortgaging our children's future, we would actually have the resources to invest in all the things that we collectively want to invest in. And there's going to come a day, it may not be today, it may not be tomorrow, but there's going to come a day where that trading away what we would define as common sense investment in our children and grandchildren is going to be debt payments to foreign lands. And I hope that brings us together. And I hope that day is today, but I appreciate Mr. Grothman for pointing that out. And I yield back.
Thank you very much. I'd like to personally thank you for your great work on the Budget Committee as the designee of the Rules Committee. Of myself, I think that your service, your intellect, your ingenuity, your really attention to business allows this entire committee to focus itself not only on your shoulders, but you represent us on that basis. I know it's only done for several months, but the attention to this, Rob, has been amazing that you've done over the last few years. And I want to thank you for your leadership. Job well done. Job well done. Mr. McGovern?
Well, thank you, and I want to thank Mr. Scott and Mr. Kowski for coming up here. I look forward to voting for both the CBC budget and the Progressive Caucus budget. As I said at the very beginning here, these budgets represent our values, what we stand for, and I think the budgets you have proposed represent my values. Mr. Rothman, I don't agree with your proposal and your viewpoints, but I do think you ought to have the right to debate your proposal on the floor. And you know, and I will tell you that if I were a betting person, I would bet that the inclination of the people up here and your party is to not allow your amendment to be made in order. And I guess my question to you, I'm trying to figure out how serious you are about this. If your amendment is not made in order, would you vote against the rule?
No.
All right, well then, it was nice that you spent all this time up here. I yield back.
Gentleman yields back. By the way, Mr. Grothman is most assertive, has provided himself with an opportunity to speak with me personally. I've encouraged him, and he professionally has brought his conduct, including his demeanor today, his hard work to bear, and got an opportunity to come to the Rules Committee. And I want to thank Glenn. Glenn caught me the other day, didn't catch me, it was a fair catch. He took time with me to let me know that he is serious about us making the advantages today, not to wait, not to kick the can down the road, if that's the term, and to be serious about what he sees as a serious problem for this country. And whether it's Alcee Hastings saying this, or whether it's Glenn Grothman, whether it's Bobby Scott, I thank him, but in this case, it's Glenn, and he took time, to be honest, and he took me up on it. He came up here. So
Well,
I've
no,
encouraged him
it's
to
great.
believe in the process.
You know, I would have just submitted an extension of remarks rather than sit through all this.
Well, I encouraged
you know.
him not to.
All right,
I
well,
encouraged him to do exactly what he's done, but I'll tell you what he did. He also did his darn homework. Glenn, great job. Dr. Burgess?
Thanks, Mr. Chairman. This has been, it's been a fascinating afternoon, fascinating discussion. I want to thank all of our witnesses who spent so much time talking with us. I am tempted to ask the question. Mr. Grothman, Mr. Kowski has posed a question that the top 1% needs to pay their fair share of taxes. Could someone give me what that fair share, what the amount would be? Does someone have an idea of what that amount would be? And we hear all the time, I've just pulled up the Pete Peterson Foundation, top 1% pays a significant portion of the taxes in this country. How much should they pay?
So part of the progressive budget includes my fair tax plan. You know, we have 7 tax brackets that end at about $400,000, and nothing after that. So if you make $400 million or $400,000, you're in the same bracket. So between $1 million and $1 billion, I progressively raised the tax rate up to 48% for $1 billion, which is, by the way, less than the tax rate under the Reagan administration for most of its years. So I think that if we're going to distinguish in terms of tax rates for people below $400,000, it's fair enough to say that those that are even wealthier make a greater contribution.
So your top rate would be 48%?
Yep.
Mr. Grothman, what would you think about a top rate of 48%?
Well, as all of us who believe in the Laffer curve know, and we'll educate the Congresswoman on this, the higher you raise the rate, the more people find a way to shelter their income. So it's not like if you go from, let's say, 40 to 50%, you get a 25% increase in revenue. You get significantly less than that because people invest in mutual bonds, or they don't sell property because the capital gains rates aren't as high, or they retire or do something. So I think that's the problem with high rates. In addition to other things, you wind up getting less money rather than more. People begin to make economic decisions for tax reasons. So that would make no sense.
We certainly have seen the situation that, or I should say, we haven't seen a situation that when you cut taxes, especially for the wealthy, we've tried it many, many times. This idea of trickle down, we certainly haven't seen that improve the economy. But it seems to me that it's certainly worth taxing money that's being sheltered right now overseas and bringing that money home, creating disincentives for people to outsource their jobs. It seems to me the frame through which we should look at our economy is, does this move create greater income disparity or less income disparity, bring us closer together? And I think our budget reaches that goal and that the Republican budget does not.
I thank you both for your honesty. I thank you for your presentations today, Mr. Chairman. I'll yield back.
Thank you very much. Judge Hastings.
Mr. Chairman, I
Yes,
ask
sir.
unanimous consent to include a letter from the Washington Bureau of the NAACP.
Without objection, we'll enter that in the record.
In strong support for Congressional Black Caucus's alternative budget proposal.
Yes, sir.
And I'm prepared to vote for that budget as well as the progressive budget. And I appreciate the efforts that have been put forth by Mr. Scott and Ms. Schakowsky, as well as the elucidation of Mr. Grothman. I appreciate it very much. All right. Thank you.
In fairness, Mr. Grothman presented a well-thought-out opportunity that.
I appreciate his elucidation, which I do.
Yes, sir. I'd like to give.
I'd like to get to know Mr. Grothman better because I think some of his ideas are useful, and I think your body would be helpful in
Yes, sir.
listening to him as you
Yes, sir.
seem to make sense to me.
Yes, sir.
I didn't put it down.
No,
Holding
sir.
him
Well, I think almost anybody would have considered it a negative comment, and I simply believe that each of our.
How is elucidating something negative? I have trouble understanding that.
That's explaining.
Well, then let me, if
did
it was
elucidate a
negative
number
to
of
you,
things.
Mr. Chairman, it certainly wasn't meant that way by me.
Then-
I think Mr. Grothman's points were well taken, and I think they are informative for all of us who don't seem to have the kind of comprehensive knowledge that he does in accounting, and I appreciate it. And I said that.
Then I will
and
accept that.
If that helps you better.
It does.
Okay, then I'm glad I elucidated it for you.
Thank you very much. Gentleman, Mr. Collins. Gentleman, just, Mr. Collins does not seek time. The gentleman from Alabama, Mr. Byrne.
I just have a question for Mr. Kowski. What's the total amount you're trying to raise taxes, total aggregate amount?
Let's see if I've got that number here, which I believe I may. I know that it reduces the public debt by $4 trillion in 10 years, and the tax amount is what? 1.06 trillion over the next 10 years. I'm sorry? Here's 27. Oh, over the 10-year period? Okay, I'm sorry. 8.969.
Trillion.
Yeah.
Okay, so Mr. Scott would increase taxes by 4 trillion, you would increase it by almost 9 trillion, and 2.7 trillion for the main Democratic alternative, which Mr. Yarmouth, I think, was talking about. So it seems like it's pretty fundamental, different approaches. 9 trillion tax increase, 4 trillion tax increase, Mr. Yarmouth's tax increase versus Republican tax cuts. Pretty clear difference.
As in Mr. Groffman.
And Mr. Groffman's provision. Yeah, I appreciate that. Yield back.
Gentleman yields back. Thank you very much. The gentleman from Colorado. Gentleman does.
Thank you. I'd like to respond to that. When you get to the bottom line, at least we're honest and come up with an arithmetically accurate number at the bottom. You have unstated, if you have a revenue neutral tax cut, that means you're going to raise taxes the same as you lower taxes if it's revenue neutral. Now, or unless you're using the tooth fairy to come in and make it revenue neutral, you cut taxes a couple of trillion, and the tooth fairy is going to make it revenue neutral. I think the arithmetic requires you to show where you're going to get a couple of $1 trillion in tax increases to make it revenue neutral. The question was raised as what's fair. We haven't, I think everybody will acknowledge we're in fairly tough economic times with our budget. We've got a big debt. There's no evidence that giving a tax cut where 80% goes to the top 1%, wherever you start, whatever you think you ought to end up, 80% of the benefits going to the top 1%, where that has been shown time and time again to have virtually no impact on trickle-down improvements, whereas spending like infrastructure has been shown to have a significant impact on improving the economy.
If I may respond, I believe your numbers are truthful. I believe Mr. Kowski's numbers are truthful. It's the underlying philosophy that we have a disagreement about, not about whether you've cooked the numbers or anything. I believe you've got your numbers to add up the way you need them to add up to pay for the things you want to pay for. And I do appreciate the intellectual honesty with that, I do. Thank you.
Thank you. Mr. Newhouse. Mr. Newhouse, does that? Mr. Buck.
Mr. Groffman, I just had a couple of questions. I was wondering if you could elucidate on this matter for me. The budget projection from the budget that we passed 5 or 6 months ago for this for fiscal year 18 was 1.05 trillion. I want to make sure you've got the same number I've got.
Budget what? What is that?
The projection from the budget that we just passed a few months ago, the budget for fiscal year 17, we actually project out 10 years. And the projection for fiscal year 18 was 1.057 trillion in discretionary spending. The budget that we have for fiscal year 18 is 1.13 trillion. So we have exceeded the projection that we made just a few months ago by $75 billion. $39 billion of that is in non-defense spending.
Okay. I think the point you're making, which is the point that I'll make about this mandatory reduction, is it's easy to vote on a document that predicts cuts in spending in the out years, and those cuts in spending usually don't materialize.
And I'm not even talking 10 years from now.
Right.
I'm just talking a few months ago, the prediction of where the budget would go.
I'm not sure that number is right, but I assume you're right. It wouldn't surprise me if our actual discretionary spending in this budget is higher than we predicted it would be 1 year ago or 2 years ago. That would be per usual around this place, yeah.
And who pays that? I'm
Well-
fascinated. I'm not going to project that I'm going to be in the 48% income bracket anytime soon, but I'm just wondering who ends up paying for the deficits that we're talking. We have $700 billion of deficit.
Well, ultimately, as said, I think by Mr. Woodall, eventually the interest, what you're going to do is you just keep knocking up the interest, and the interest will be paid by all of us collectively, disproportionately the well-off, but everybody's going to have to pay the price, and someday, you know, as is predicted when you talk about forms of government based on elections, they eventually go under because people can't stop spending money to buy votes. That's ultimately what happens.
So, Mr. Grothman, we're talking about trickle-down economics, and some in this room suggest that it doesn't work. What happens when we end up with a debt-to-GDP ratio around 150%?
Well, I think you get to a point where it's almost beyond correcting. I will point out, I always think there's a difference between trickle-down economics and supply-side economics.
And I agree with you, but I'm trying to figure out whether there is trickle-down misery that is on the horizon in this country.
Well, I think if the value of the dollar is someday not the world's reserve currency, the people at the lower end or the middle class are the ones who are going to pay the price, if that's what you mean. And I think that's where we're headed someday.
Thank you. I yield back.
Gentleman yields back his time. The gentleman from Wyoming does not seek time. Is there any other member that seek time? Gentleman, Mr. Scott.
Mr. Chairman, on behalf of CBC Chair Cedric Richmond, I appreciate your hospitality and look forward to being able to present the budget on the floor.
Well, thank you very much. I would like to also thank all three of you for not only taking your time today, but what obviously was a lot of hard work, a lot of thought process, and a lot of defense of your ideas. All three of you are to be congratulated for coming up today. I would like to add that our awesome stenographer is here, and if you brought something in writing that would allow her to finalize her product properly today, it would be appreciated by her and by myself. So thank you very much. Okay, is there any other member that would seek time to talk with us today about HCON Res 71? Seeing none, this now closes the hearing portion of HCON Res 71, and the chair will be in receipt of a motion from the distinguished Vice Chairman from Oklahoma, Mr. Cole.
Mr. Chairman, I move the committee grant HCON Res 71, establishing the congressional budget for the United States for the fiscal year 2018 and setting forth the appropriate budgetary levels for fiscal years 2019 through 2027 as structured rule. The rule provides 4 hours of general debate with 3 hours confined to the congressional budget, equally divided and controlled by the chair and ranking minority member of the Committee on Budget, and 1 hour on the subject of economic goals and policies, equally divided and controlled by Representative T. Berry of Ohio and Representative Carolyn Maloney of New York or their respective designees. The rule waives all points of order against consideration of the concurrent resolution and provides that the concurrent resolution shall be considered as read. The rule makes an order only those amendments printed in the Rules Committee report. Each such amendment may be offered only in the order printed in the report, may be offered only by the member designated in the report, shall be considered as read, shall be debatable for the time specified in the report, equally divided and controlled by the proponent and unopponent, and shall not be subject to amendment. The rule waives all points of order against the amendments printed in the report, except for that the adoption of an amendment in the nature of a substitute shall constitute the conclusion of consideration of the concurrent resolution for the amendment. The rule provides that upon the conclusion of consideration of the concurrent resolution for amendment, a final period of general debate, which shall not exceed 10 minutes, equally divided and controlled by the chair and ranking minority member of the Committee on the Budget. The rule permits the chair of the Budget Committee to offer amendments in the House pursuant to Section 305A 5 of the Congressional Budget Act of 1974 to achieve mathematical consistency. Finally, the rule provides that the concurrent resolution shall not be subject to a demand for division of the question of its adoption.
Thank you very much. You've now heard the motion from the gentleman from Oklahoma. Is there amendment or discussion to that? Gentleman from Massachusetts.
Mr. Chairman, I have an amendment to the rule. I move the committee make and order all the amendments submitted to H. Con Res. 71. This would include the Grothman amendment, and urge my colleagues to vote yes.
Thank you very much. Part of the discussion, what we have here is a structured rule, 4 hours of debate, 3 hours to budget, 1 hour to joint economic council. Makes an order all 4 substitute amendments and provides 30 minutes each to debate. Mr. McClintock, Mr. Pocan, Mr. Scott, Mr. Yarmouth. And so what he wants to do is make these amendments in order. Other amendments, is there further discussion? Vote will now be on the McGovern amendment. Those in favor signify by saying aye.
Aye.
Those opposed, no. Noes have it, noes have
roll
it.
call.
Gentleman asks for a roll call vote. Clerk will poll the committee.
Mr. Cole? No. Mr. Cole, no. Mr. Woodall? No. Mr. Woodall, no. Mr. Burgess? Mr. Burgess, no. Mr. Collins? Mr. Collins, no. Mr. Byrne? Mr. Byrne, no. Mr. Newhouse? Mr. Newhouse, no. Mr. Buck? Mr. Buck, no. Ms. Cheney? Ms. Cheney, no. Ms. Slaughter? Ms. Slaughter, aye. Mr. McGovern?
Aye.
Mr. McGovern, aye. Mr. Hastings? Aye. Mr. Hastings, aye. Mr. Polis? Aye. Mr. Polis, aye. Mr. Chairman?
No.
Mr. Chairman, no.
Clerk will report.
4 yeas, 9 nays.
Amendments not agreed to, none agreed to. Further.
One other amendment, Mr.
Gentleman's
Chairman.
recognized.
I have an amendment to the rule. I move the committee make an order and give the necessary waivers for the amendment to H. Con Res. 71 by myself and Representative Lujan Grisham, number 1, which would prevent cuts to the Supplemental Nutrition Assistance Program, known as SNAP, by exempting SNAP from reconciliation instructions. It prevents stricter time limits and more onerous work requirements in SNAP, and prevents the program from being converted into a block grant.
Thank you very much. Discussion. Vote now be on the McGovern amendment. Those in favor signify by saying aye. Aye. Those opposed, no. No. Those have it,
I
noes
ask for a
have it.
roll call.
Gentleman asks for a roll call vote.
Mr. Cole?
Clerk will poll the committee.
Mr. Cole, no. Mr. Woodall? No. Mr. Woodall, no. Mr. Burgess? Mr. Burgess, no. Mr. Collins? Mr. Collins, no. Mr. Byrne? Mr. Byrne, no. Mr. Newhouse? Mr. Newhouse, no. Mr. Buck? Mr. Buck, no. Ms. Cheney? Ms. Cheney, no. Ms. Slaughter? Ms. Slaughter, aye. Mr. McGovern?
Aye.
Mr. McGovern, aye. Mr. Hastings? Mr. Hastings, aye. Mr. Polis? Mr. Polis, aye. Mr. Chairman?
No.
Mr. Chairman, no.
Clerk will report.
4 yeas, 9 nays.
The amendment's not agreed to. Further amendment or discussion? Seeing none, the vote now be on the motion from the gentleman, distinguished gentleman from Oklahoma, Mr. Cole. Those in favor signify by saying aye. Aye. Those opposed, no.
No.
Ayes have it, the ayes have it. Accordingly,
We ask for a roll call, Mr. Chairman?
gentleman asks for a roll call vote. Clerk will hold the committee.
Mr. Cole? Aye. Mr. Cole, aye. Mr. Woodall? Aye. Mr. Woodall, aye. Mr. Burgess? Mr. Burgess, aye. Mr. Collins? Aye. Mr. Collins, aye. Mr. Byrne? Aye. Mr. Byrne, aye. Mr. Newhouse? Aye. Mr. Newhouse? Mr. Buck? Aye. Mr. Buck, aye. Ms. Cheney? Aye. Ms. Cheney, aye. Ms. Slaughter? No. Ms. Slaughter, no. Mr. McGovern?
No.
Mr. McGovern, no. Mr. Hastings? Mr. Hastings, no. Mr. Polis? No. Mr. Polis, no. Mr. Chairman?
Aye.
Mr. Chairman, aye.
Clerk will report the total.
9 yeas, 4 nays.
Motion is agreed to. Accordingly, the gentleman, Mr. Woodall from Georgia, will handle this for Republicans. Mr. McGovern will be handling this for Democrats. The question that always comes up, do we expect any additional meetings this week? The Rules Committee is not scheduled, nor do we expect any other meetings this week. Thank you very much. We completed our work for the day.